Well, welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 304th meeting since we started in February 2009. We put a different speaker on every week, a different subject. We require our speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give an hour to make a presentation. If they go over an hour, we cut them off. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter we listen only one fool at a time. It's one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience, not speeches. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in this audience that wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond what the speaker said for or against. And our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment, and close the meeting. That's how it works. But before we put in our speaker, we have announcements. Now is the time for announcements. Anybody have announcements? Now's the time to make them. Any announcements? Oh, I have one announcement. Anthony Scalia is dead. I heard that. Some people are happy about that. Anyway. All right, here, we'll let you do it.
All right. Next Sunday, the 21st, at the Jewish Community Center, February the 21st at 9:30 a.m. the program starts. Do truth and accuracy still matter in politics? And Dr. Rita Kirk's going to talk. She's director of the McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility at SMU. Tony Peterson, the Bellow Foundation, endowed Distinguished Chair in Journalism, SMU, and Aaron Timmons, Director of Debate at Green Hill School and Head Coach, USA Debate Team. Next Sunday at the Jewish Community Center, off North Haven.
Which room?
Let's see. Just go in, they'll tell you. Yeah, it's presented by the Brotherhood. 9:30 to 11:30. It'll be 9:30 to 11 a.m. Do you need to
Yeah, it'd be great.
pass it around or?
Yeah.
I'll go.
Oh, good.
I'll go. Any other announcements? Now's the time. If you have announcements, now's the time to make them. You got an announcement to make? Oh, good. Jim Davis.
My reliable sources have just informed me that on November 8th, Obama's coming after your guns. So if you're a Republican, whatever you do, don't leave your house.
Any other announcements? Okay. Next week, we have George Dolan, president of Texas Alliance for Retired Americans, to talk about opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That'll be very interesting. He'll have all the arguments about it. And he's going to talk about that, and he'll offer suggestions of what can be done to reverse this calamity. Anyway, that's next week. It's on the itinerary. You can look it up there. Tonight we have, 2 weeks from now, John Beasley is going to be our speaker. I forget, he's sitting right there. He told me tonight he would like to be our speaker. I says, fine, that's wonderful. You'll be our speaker. So he has a title. I forget, what's the title, John?
It's called How America Committed Socioeconomic Suicide.
How America Committed Social Economic Suicide. That's basically the title. Anyway, or did America commit socially? Anyway, along those lines. Our speaker tonight is Paul Wuensch. He's a retired psychotherapist. He's going to discuss how the system of checks and balances and separation of powers of the U.S. Constitution effectively guarantees paralysis. He will show that whether a candidate of the right or the left is elected president this year, the chances of getting his or her agenda passed are slim. Indeed, the likely result will be gridlock we have come to know and suffer with. In a system designed to inhibit change, Paul will argue that may be fine, but consider the fact that the inhibition of change has allowed grave injustice such as slavery and denial of civil rights to ruin people's lives for generations, and that other democracies, notably the United Kingdom, have a parliamentary system in which the elected majority can govern more effectively. He is not advocating a UK-style parliamentary system. Rather, Ed Paul will lay the groundwork to show how the amendment process is a path to a stronger and more effective U.S. Constitution. So without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Ed Paul Wuensch.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think I'll start off with a little story. Two guys lived in New York City, and the one guy was a native New Yorker, and the other one was from the Czech Republic. And so the two of them decided to take a vacation in the Czech Republic. And so they went out to the woods and started hiking, and a bear jumped out, ate the Czech. Well, the New Yorker went running back to the town, and the hunters went out, and boom, 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 it sounded like a war in the woods. Anyhow, they came back dragging not one but two bears. And so they said to the New Yorker, well, which one ate your friend? And he said, well, it's kind of hard to tell, but I think it's that one right there. He pointed, one was a male, one was a female. He pointed to the male, okay? And what's the moral?
What happened first?
The moral is never believe a New Yorker who tells you that the check is in the mail. Thank you for that. Mercy. Several times in recent memory, our government has been shut down as the executive and legislative branches were unable to reach agreement on the terms of a budget. The Congress had the power to enact a budget with which the President could not accept. The President had the power to veto the legislation. With both branches deadlocked, the familiar problem of paralysis caused the government to fall into a state of dysfunction. Because of the way in which the separation of powers is established by the Constitution, the executive and legislative branches exerted negative force on each other, but neither branch was able to exert a positive force, that is, to get its program enacted. Senator Bill Bradley, I think a highly respected senator by popular consensus, and maybe on both sides of the aisle as well. But he kind of gave up in frustration back in the previous century. He said, "Politics is broken." And with that, he announced his retirement from Congress. The frustration which he expressed reflected a political system which has failed to govern in a reasonably effective manner. Such failure has been described variously as paralysis, stalemate, or gridlock. The political and social costs of perpetuating ineffective government have motivated some prominent citizens to propose alternatives to the present constitutional structure. Lloyd Cutler, former counsel to the president, in 1980 reasoned that the existing structure made it impossible for a U.S. president, quote, to form a government, unquote. In other democracies, as a matter of course, prime ministers are called upon to form governments. Inferred in the expression form a government is the clear understanding that the government has the power to carry out its legislative agenda. Cutler argued further that the separation of powers was the element in the U.S. Constitution which was most instrumental in practically guaranteeing a stalemate on strongly contested issues. He went on to outline how other leading democracies have been able to govern themselves effectively under other systems, such as parliamentary. Under the parliamentary model, the executive branch is the offspring of the legislature, and it reflects a cohesion between the two branches, which allows a regime to succeed in having its basic program enacted. Nevertheless, strong checks and balances are present between the two branches in that type of government as well. An absence of good people in government is not the problem. There are many people who are employed in the government service there are many people employed in government service whose integrity and ability have been recognized by broad consensus. And the problem is, however, that the political system itself, under the U.S. Constitution, often does not permit dedicated and capable people to accomplish their tasks. There is no question that good people must be present in government service in order that just and effective administration may be experienced. World history, however, provides ample evidence that often good people have been rendered powerless to govern effectively. For example, in France, under the Fourth Republic, which lasted from the end of World War II until 1958, a chaotic system prevailed. This was a parliamentary system of government. Under their system, members of the National Assembly owed no allegiance to the Premier and to the Cabinet. The structure allowed the Assembly to cause the fall of many governments through votes of no confidence or rejection of key government legislation. There existed, however, no counterbalancing powers for dealing with the legislature. It became impossible for any premier to exercise effective leadership. Each member or subgroup of the Assembly was free to pursue his or her own agenda and defy the executive office with impunity. As a result, issues in need of urgent attention were neglected. The nation suffered greatly because it was being governed ineffectively, if at all. And in 1958, matters reached a crisis point when the withdrawal from Algeria resulted in the grave likelihood of a military takeover. Such a coup was avoided only by the creation and adoption of a new and more effective constitution under the auspices of General de Gaulle. Doubtless good people were present both in government office and in the Assembly in the Fourth Republic. Indeed, many of them continued to serve, this time effectively, in the Fifth Republic. It was the system, that is, the structure of government itself, which made it impossible for dedicated and competent leaders to be effective in the Fourth Republic. Thus, both reason and historical experience argue convincingly that flawed systems have prevented good people from being able to govern effectively. On May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill was summoned to Buckingham Palace. His Majesty received me, he said, most graciously, and bade me to sit down. He looked at me searchingly and quizzically for some moments, and then said, "I suppose you don't know why I have sent for you." Adopting his mood, I replied, "Sir, I simply couldn't imagine why." He laughed and said, "I want to ask you to form a government." I said I would. Certainly do so. Okay. citing the inability of U.S. administrations to form a government, Cutler in 1980 reasoned that the separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branches cannot but result in stalemates on contested issues. He related a breakdown in the modern decision-making process specifically to the structural dysfunction precipitated by conflicts built into the separation of powers features of the Constitution. As a result, the formation of a government, analogous to the parliamentary process whereby that type of government is capable of carrying out its program, is rendered impossible as a consequence of the U.S. system of checks and balances mandated in the extreme by the Constitution. Nevertheless, people elect presidents in the belief that the resulting administration should be expected to carry out its campaign promises. Anybody hear anything about that recently? Implicit in Cutler's description was the expectation, the notion that the president is a very powerful executive. Perhaps, but not entirely, okay? Cutler used President Carter's failure to obtain ratification of the 1979 SALT II Treaty by the U.S. Senate as an example of structural weakness. Although the constitutional requirement of advice and consent represents a special foreign policy situation, still it exemplifies presidential impotence in dealing with the Congress. It is noteworthy that no parliamentary democracy in the world that I'm aware of requires similar legislative second-guessing on the executive's treaty negotiating power. Cutler also pointed out that although standard legislation requires only a simple majority to be enacted, such approval is not easy to obtain. Component parts of a bill supported by the White House can be discarded at will by the Congress. Amendments at the same time may make the same bill almost unrecognizable. So often when a vote finally comes up on the altered bill, the result is rejection. By means of veto, presumably. According to Cutler, such congressional defiance is not necessarily the outcome of having a president and a Congress majority made up of opposing political parties. Frequently, and we've seen this in recent time, a president cannot even count on legislative achievement when his own party controls the Congress. Puts me in mind of the arm twisting that went on in the outset of the Obama administration upon taking office in 2010. This kind of dysfunction can be compared with the structure of parliamentary governments, where the key to effectiveness is the fact that the executive branch is made up of members of the legislature who have been selected by the majority of that form to form a government. The selected members are termed the cabinet, and in turn they are led by one individual from their number, termed the prime minister, premier, or chancellor. The term government in the parliamentary system carries the specific connotation of a ruling body within the parliament. Indispensable to Cutler's description of a parliamentary government is the concept of collective responsibility. This means that if any major portion of the legislative agenda is defeated, or if no confidence vote is delivered by the parliament, the government falls. Consequently, a new cabinet must be Consequently, a new cabinet must be formed, or failing in that, new elections held. Members of the parliament being reluctant to risk their seats without strong reasons have a structurally built-in motivation to support the government. And it is interesting, therefore, that the power of a legislator to defeat a government embodies the very dynamic which often makes the legislature disinclined to use the power. I don't know what I just read, but I just read it. I hope it makes sense. I wrote it one time. Anyway, The force at work in that case is collective responsibility. All stand or fall together. The cabinet is the microcosm of collective responsibility, reflecting the sentiment of the parliament as a whole. Occasionally, prime ministers direct their attention to their cabinet. Usually, the attention is directed to the cabinet. If the cabinet falls in line, generally the legislature will follow the wishes of the government. Structural aspects. In his approach to the problem of interbranch dysfunction, Cutler noted that in bygone days, a Franklin D. Roosevelt or a Lyndon B. Johnson had a national consensus substantial enough to push a New Deal or a Great Society through Congress. Without passing judgment on the merit of these programs, it is noteworthy that the problem of paralysis was overcome on those occasions. However, these citations of rare instances of cohesion highlight the fact that cohesion has occurred only on a sporadic and usually crisis-associated basis. The infrequency of cohesion is understood. The reasoning being, from that point, that it seems logical to query why the U.S. government can pull together in times of crisis and not do so in normal times. It appears that the legislative executive cohesion in normal times could avert many a crisis, with the prevention generally considered preferable to cure. The logic thus brings the discussion back to the need for structural correction of the problem, so that cohesion, not paralysis, can characterize the U.S. constitutional system. In the use of the term systemic or structural or constitutional, it can be seen that much the same meaning is conveyed. Correlating the problems of paralysis, lack of cohesion, and interbranch dysfunction, since they carry much the same connotation of the problem. Excuse me, but I'm just going to leave that where it lay. And move on to solutions and proposals. Okay. The structural feature, which we've identified, is the separation of powers. The separation of powers gives both the executive and legislative branches the power to paralyze each other. The effect is an isolating one, separating the branches all too well. Having identified separation of powers as the principal structural deficiency, we move to an examination of the constitutional amendment process. Because of the difficulties of convening a constitutional convention, it has been suggested in the first step that a bipartisan presidential commission with possibly a parallel congressional joint commission could address the problem. By being made responsible to the President or the Congress, such a commission would be expected to have its recommendations pursued further with a view to ultimate action in the form of proposed constitutional amendments. Such proposed amendments might be the result either of a constitutional convention or the two-thirds of a House and Senate method. Results, principles, and recommendations. Any statement of general principles for the constitutional change must be based on the recognition of the problem of structural dysfunction. That is, there is a problem of paralysis which is rooted in the separation of powers provisions of the Constitution. Thus, the crux of the problem of paralysis lies in the separation of powers provisions. This is not to say, as in linear form of reasoning, that the solution to the problem is to abolish the separation of powers. The first general principle, which is submitted here, would be that the separation of powers doctrine should be preserved. There are two compelling reasons for preserving the separation of powers. The first is that it would be difficult or impossible to abolish something that has stood for so long and is kind of an article of faith in the thinking of the electorate. The second reason for keeping the separation of powers is that the doctrine has enormous values. So working within that framework, what we would seek, and this is principle number 2, a new balance in the separation of powers. The third principle is as follows. Study should be made of the experience of other democratic nations in the design of their national constitutions. Often proposals for structural change have side effects which can be quite disconcerting. Architects of change should anticipate as much as possible the potential for such consequences. And it goes on and on. Okay. The list of other nations which have had experiences that we can benefit from include the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Israel, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Japan, and others. None of these serves as a perfect model, but each has experienced relative success in blending pluralism, stability, and effectiveness. The fourth general principle is, at a high level, officially constituted commissions should be established to carry out the work of structural reform. At the present time, the dialogue on structural reform in the U.S. is being conducted in academic writing, other literature, and informal discussion. There exists no official body answerable to any arm of the government which is charged with that responsibility. The fifth and last general principle is members of Congress should commit themselves officially to taking action on amending the U.S. Constitution. A constitutional convention would be the more logical form for such a change, but congressionally proposed amendments have been the only form of amendment employed to date. Either method would suffice, however. And I think at this point I'll just depart from this text. I suppose it will take a crisis of some sort to provide the fear and the motivation to make the necessary changes. But hopefully, at some point in the future, we can get get to the point where meaningful change can be enacted. With that, I'm going to conclude my remarks. Thank you very much.
You can stay there and answer questions.
May I ask the first question?
Yeah, sure.
Let's see.
I'd like to actually ask two questions. One is a structural question, and the other one is a psychological question. The structural question is that, do you think that the fact that 50 senators in the United States Senate only represent 24% of the population creates a structural problem because of the lack of population in some of the smaller states?
All right, the gerrymandering, right?
No. Okay, each state has 2 senators, and
Yeah.
and 50 senators represent 25 states, which comprise 24% of the population. So you have 50 senators representing 75% of the population and 50 representing 25% of the population.
So Wyoming has 2 senators and a very low population, and the larger states, California, Texas, New York.
Exactly, so that's the structural question.
Yeah.
Then the psychological question is, why is it that it's so much easier to claim that the government does not work, that taxation is theft, and so on, rather than to make statements about the actual things that the government has done that are proper and done well? Is that a psychological issue in human beings, or is it a psychological issue with Republicans?
Human nature, I suppose.
But anyway, the structural thing.
Yeah, but your point is well taken.
No, I was asking if you think that's part of the problem.
Yeah. It's such a multifaceted problem. I mean, there are so many things that go into it.
Yes, next question. What sort of cataclysmic event will it take to create this constitutional convention, do you think?
I don't know.
That's a good one. Well, do you think that another huge crash of the financial system would do it?
Possibly, yes.
If you would give us a couple of examples of things you have seen, past tense, that have gotten up into the Congress, that deserved completed process and a bill passed and sent up to the president for signature, that have been precluded from that event being achieved because of what you're describing. Give us an example of the pockmarks that are being caused in the road by this. I mean, we can say it's evil, but what is the evil?
Yeah. Well, I'm drawing a blank here, but
Immigration.
okay, immigration. I'm open to your inputs.
Well, I have another question, and the question goes to the whether you can explain or not why gridlock isn't a good thing.
Well, okay. Evidently, evidently gridlock is considered a good thing depending on your point of view. In other words, if the opposing political philosophy gets its way, then gridlock will be a good thing if we can prevent it from becoming enacted all the way.
Yes, ask the question.
Yeah.
Question.
Question. Under a parliamentary system, how would passage of the TPP proceed? Right now, the president wants to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and members, lots of, it has to have approval of Congress.
Yeah.
How would that work in a parliamentary system?
Well, in a parliamentary system of government, which I'm not recommending a parliamentary system for the United States, by the way, but it serves as a model, doesn't it? So, I would think that if the government were to enact something like that, such as the TPP, it would reflect the will of the majority that elected that government. That would be my response. Yeah.
Our system was set up by individual states, and those individual states were supposed to be equally represented. In addition to that, there are different proportions of people in those states, so instead of just having a Senate, we have a House of Representatives as well to balance that out. Now, why would it be better for one side to rush through all of their policies rather than learn to compromise and everybody get a little bit of what they want and nobody get 100%? Because our nation built the most prosperous nation on earth through free enterprise that has since been taken over by greed, by capitalism, which I do not consider a good American word. How can we get rid of the influence of money on Congress? Isn't this really the biggest thing?
Well, it sure is. And, well, okay, what we have is members of Congress whose number one job is to get reelected and, of course, raise money for reelection. It's gotten to be a ridiculous thing, of course. And in a way, that's part of the problem. I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you.
It's like the Clinton Wall Street money that's coming out.
Mm-hmm.
Which amendment?
If, as you say, Congress is dysfunctional and gridlocked, and I think we probably agree with that, how would you ever expect them to get a 2/3 majority to get any constitutional amendment out?
Most, I think it would require a national crisis of some sort.
Well, what about the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which allows the states to call a convention of the states? The states can initiate this, and there was a meeting this past Tuesday night of a national organization that is moving to get states to formulate rules for a convention, rather than use a oppressive elitist presidential commission that nobody would follow. The people in the several states will formulate their own constitutional amendments, then that will force the government to have a convention of the states where the amendments can be debated and voted upon. And if they're voted out, then they have to be approved by 3/4 of the state before they become a constitutional amendment. What's wrong with that process?
Nothing, but it has, to my knowledge, it has never been put to work. In other words, I believe that to date, the amendments to the Constitution have gone the congressional route rather than the state route.
And they never get out.
Yeah, but the point you raise is really helpful, because a constitutional convention to deal with the matters that we're talking about would most likely come out of the 2/3 of the states method, in my view.
Okay, I have a question. I think one of our great challenges from the beginning was having a national character, which I don't think we have. So my question is, what do you think is the possibility of a crisis fragmenting the country rather than pulling it together? We seem to know who we are in wartime, but not in peacetime. And I'm, especially with the applause for gridlock, I'm not sure people care about a unified national government anymore. And I'm wondering what's your feeling about a crisis splitting the nation into regions?
Yeah. I don't know what type of crisis it would be, but my guess would be more likely it would be something related to great wealth disparity. I think we're seeing that in the frustration that we're hearing about in the media these days.
Okay, my question is, if the Congress right now, which is composed of representatives from all the states, can't get together on anything, what makes anybody think that the states getting together is going to solve the problem? We have the same problem in every state, that they can't get together and do anything.
Yeah, I think pressure would be the operative force.
Which do you think would be more likely to trigger a convention or a Congress acting? A national debt that proceeded from 19 trillion to 25 or 30 trillion, and we couldn't pay the interest rates go up, we couldn't pay the interest, and there's default on national debt, or a disparity in incomes. Which one do you think would be more likely to trigger a crisis?
I think that the former would be the cause of the latter, wouldn't it?
No, the latter's already here. I mean, the disparity in income is already here.
Yeah,
but the debt is growing. The only reason we are able to survive is because interest rates are so low. But if the debt continues to go, you talk about a crisis, there'll be a crisis, all right.
Yeah, that would be a crisis precipitated by by defaults, which in turn would hit millions of people, ordinary people, really hard. So that might be the type of thing that could motivate constitutional change. Have I answered your question?
Well, I think the question is, we don't need a crisis. We have a Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, and people are, it's happened once. It's another question.
Use the mic.
No, it's not a question, so it's an answer.
Well, then do that in the comments.
Don't you think that the Federal Reserve plays an important role in due to the fact that they can adjust the interest rates?
Yeah.
Doesn't that make that organization a worthwhile organization?
A worthwhile organization?
Yes.
Well, it's a central bank, and other countries have central banks, and we have our central bank.
But there's a lot of people who think it's evil and wicked.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Some of us applauded whenever we talked about gridlock, and it seems to me that the one of the aspects of gridlock is that is what helps to protect the rights of the minority. If the majority are able to ram through legislation with a simple majority of 51%, then that runs the risk of violating the rights of the minority, the 49% who were not in favor of that legislation. So whenever we're applauding gridlock, it has to do with it respecting the rights of the minorities.
This kind of takes us to the basic, a basic philosophy of the role of government. The Leviathan, let's say, which was written by Thomas Hobbes, I believe in 1851 or 1651, excuse me, during as a result of the English Civil War, terrible time, and because his contention was that the government should be duly constituted, but having done that, then the government must be very powerful, must be have the powerful of a Leviathan, the image of a powerful crocodile, when it comes to view. But okay, yeah. Throwing a monkey wrench into the program of the government in defense of minority rights. I guess we just can't have it both ways.
I just want to clarify, the Fifth Amendment is
not the Fifth Amendment, Article 5.
Exactly.
Two different things. Two different things.
Exactly. Article 5 is where we get our right for a constitutional convention to be called. The Fifth Amendment is so that we have the right not to incriminate
Right.
ourselves.
Thank you.
We're out of questions? Looks like we're out of questions. You get to sit down.
Thank you all.
Okay, now it's your turn to talk, so if you want to be a speaker, there's this chair up here, so come on up here. Take your turn in line.
I don't think it can be said more clearly than the tyranny of the 51%. The founders had just come out of the tyranny of Britain. And the government that we were given in the Constitution has been stated by different thinkers as being the most anti-government government that has ever been executed. And that is for a reason. Back at a convention in Atlanta, I got to hear a gentleman by the name of Charlie Smith, a black man who worked in the community to raise people up. He had a party he called the Do Nothing Party. And the Do Nothing Party would only run candidates who would pledge to get in office and do nothing. Because when someone really analyzes government, how government functions, what the results are, everyone who goes to fix something usually ends up making things worse in some way or other. But luckily, laws have sunset clauses. So over time, if you do nothing, if you get enough candidates to do nothing, all this bad law will begin to wash itself out. And then we will have a little breathing space, less regulation, more liberty. I think that this is one of those really nasty items that is difficult to discuss and not get someone taking a swing at you afterward. But
the left really doesn't seem to understand, they don't seem to have that nerve that informs them of tyranny. The more you set up a direct power of the executive, the more you streamline things so that the executive can get things done, well, you're not thinking the whole thing through, because 4 years later, that could go to the other party. And then you have basically a strong executive on the right. And then everything you work for in the way of social justice then gets basically overturned in very, very quick order. I can't see any advantage to empowering our government officials. I can't see any advantage in having powerful leaders who can do things. I see advantage in having public servants who serve the public and respect those reserved rights which we have had given to us in the Constitution. And this, if anything, really underlines my misgivings about a con-con, even an organization of the states, because it shows that in our present time, in our present collective paradigm, we do not seem to have the wisdom to understand the roots of liberty, what its fingers and toes are, how it walks and talks. So this is something that I think, if what do they say? If it's not broke, don't fix it. So I guess the debate is whether it's broke or not.
Okay, well, that was interesting. There is so much to say, and in a couple of weeks I'll have a lot more to say on this very topic. I think the crisis of America is here. And it's the result of 30 years of laissez-faire government, do-nothing government. So people are very happy, especially the ultra-rich, with do-nothing, the status quo. They don't want change because they're doing very nicely. But the bulk of the population, especially the poorest, fifth or more, are not. In fact, the statistics, which I'll bring up 2 weeks' time, are staggering, okay? Are staggering. This country is deeply in debt. It's losing its shirt. We have a real crisis. And and I'll go through, as I've always before, a series of reforms we needed. Now, this sort of government with gridlock will never do it. It can't do it, because the power of money and the status quo will never change. Now, in a parliamentary system, you do get change. So I'll say a few words about a parliamentary system. Now, May the 8th, 1940 was a significant date. Number one, my sister was born. And number two, there was an event in Parliament. Now, the Prime Minister at the time was Neville Chamberlain, okay, who, of course, went to Hitler and came back with a piece of paper saying, peace in our time, okay? It turned out that the wipeout of Guernica, 1937, 3 years later, London got a full blast of the same thing, okay? The war was going very badly. Neville Chamberlain got up and said, all I can offer you is sacrifice, okay, to meet the challenge. And David Lloyd George, who was over 80, he was a former Prime Minister, jumped up and said, the Prime Minister has talked about sacrifice. I suggest to the Prime Minister that he sacrifice himself and resign. And the whole House got up and cheered. And that wiped out the government, okay? So now, that's why Churchill was called to the king. Now, 1945, after Churchill was a successful war leader, we had another huge change. Now, my uncles and dad came back from the war saying one thing, we'll never again. We're not going to put up with this system. And we had a huge change, and the Labour government came in, and they changed everything because they had the power to do it, and they drove through the welfare state, of which I was a prime beneficiary. A huge change that could never happen in this country. Now, what amazes me, the population of America went through the 30s, even in a more dire conditions than in UK, and war ended, there was no change. Okay? In fact, what happened was McCarthy came in, and the big thing was anti-communism. Anybody who had any progressive ideas was called a pinky, a lefty, a commie, and there were commies in the State Department, everywhere else, and the public bought it. So there was no change in America, and you've had laissez-faire for 30 years, and it's been a disaster, a total disaster. So parliamentary systems do work. Britain has developed its system over 900 years. In fact, what happened recently, we had this neocon government, voted in back last May, and they were bringing in legislation after legislation to destroy the social compact. And one law was to eliminate the in-work benefit. Now, that would have passed, but it went to the House of Lords that reviewed it and said, no, this can never, and they're a deliberative body. They cannot really pass the laws, but they can deliberate and talk about them. And it prompted a national discussion. And it was so shameful on the government, they had to change their policies. So governments can fall by acclamation or by a loss in the parliament. If there's a vote of no confidence, they're gone, okay? So it's very effective. If you have to do things, you can get it done in this system. And America, by God, needs some drastic changes, really. It cannot go on. This is a road to disaster that it's on. And unless you have some form of change along every institution, I don't care what it is, this country is going down the drain for more disaster. Because the status quo and the people that are running things love it the way it is. And it's a disaster for most Americans.
I think that if the American people had a good knowledge of the events of the 20th century and made enough demands on, I don't care whether it's a Republican or a Democratic Congress, that I think that's the only way we're going to save this country, public demand or lack of. And I also think that if Bernie Sanders was to get elected and get his agenda through, he would end up making a large percentage of the 47% of the people that pay no income taxes, income tax payers. Deficit spending, problem solved.
Well, my notes are random, so this probably won't be too coherent. First, concerning the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they have not even turned loose hundreds of pages of this document for our government to read. This is a fascist organization. You will not be able to go to courts in the United States over issues with the countries involved in the TPP, the trade issues. You will have to go to a corporate-run council for their advice and their decisions. It's the end of the United States government as we know it. End of representative government. I don't think anybody in this room is as smart as Thomas Jefferson. Has anybody in this room started studying foreign languages at the age of 5? Nobody. This man was brilliant, as were many of those people. You know, if you believe in a God, they placed those men here in that era to form the government that we have. The most brilliant form of government that humanity had up until that time, up until when it was formed. And Otto Bismarck, for instance, a brilliant, brilliant negotiator who brought all of those warring tribes of Germany together into one country and then formed a single language out of many dialects, made the statement essentially that the experiment being carried out in the United States may hold the hope for freedom of humanity in the future. During our Civil War, the Tsar of Russia put his navy in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and told France and England, you will not go back and try to get your colonies or you will be at war with Russia. He understood how important this was for humanity, what we're doing here. Try that sometime. Try to read the Federalist Papers. Can you do it? Do you understand the vocabulary in it? I find them a little difficult. I have to go to the dictionary to read those papers. Those were for street people at the time. They were better educated than we are. There has been a systematic deterioration of education in this country. I go over to meet some friends now and then at night at Cain's on Greenville over there, and some of these students come in, and my God, they're idiots. I'm sorry that they couldn't tell you anything about our history. It's Outcome-Based Education is a book that I've referred to several times. Read the book Outcome-Based Education. It was written by a legislator out in, I think, Oregon. In 1811, the United States had a gross population of under 3.5 million people. Today it's, what, 350 million, 100 times that?
About 380, I believe.
380? Much more than that. Well, anyway, it's a hell of a lot more, isn't it? We are being overwhelmed with numbers, and you want to import more of them? Particularly people who don't fit in with our culture? I think you're insane, frankly, because we cannot save the entire world. It is physically impossible. Like I said last week, we are in a sinking lifeboat in a storm. And we need to realize that only some of the people in the world are going to survive. And if you think you can save them all, you're all going down in the ship. I hate to say that because I love individual people and animals, which people treat horribly. But nevertheless, let's see here. Education, emotions. I see a lot of emotion in this room. And emotions are the most dangerous thing you have. You have to have emotions not to be psychopathic. But you have to have at least an equal balance of reason and intelligence and discipline to notice the emotions, but put them aside and think, now what's going to work for everybody here? And let's compromise on it. That's what our government used to do. They don't do that so much anymore. They've been paid off so that the antitrust laws that we have on the books are not being enforced. So we've got huge pharmaceutical, we've got Monsanto, huge oil companies. The monies that these have rule the world today through us. And we go over and commit all these foreign wars that are crimes against humanity. It's hard. It is hard to believe that I am living in the country I grew up in. That country does not exist anymore. Our government is not regulating. It's being paid off to not regulate. That's why the antitrust laws are not being used. Now, you know, we have a lot of our origins from Great Britain and so forth, and a lot of the history that we have all over the world through all time is false history. It was written by the winners. Now, Churchill was stopped by the Allies from bombing German cities with anthrax. He wanted to do that. Man, is that the ultimate of hatred. There's an island where they tested this stuff off the coast of Scotland that you still can't go on today because the anthrax lives in the soil. I'm not a fan of Winston Churchill. The night of the day he was appointed prime minister, he ordered the bombing of German cities. Not military targets, cities. That started the shooting of World War II. You can go on the internet and find them today. There are speeches that Hitler made saying that he respected Great Britain, that the stability of Britain was essential to peace in Europe, and if they were ever attacked, Germany would come to their defense. But he made it very clear that he wanted to get the German people who were carved out of Germany with that illegal Treaty of Versailles into Czechoslovakia and Poland back. And he wanted to do it by negotiation. They would not negotiate, so he went in with the military. I'd have done the same damn thing because those German people were being treated horribly by Czechoslovakia and Poland. We had a lot of prosperity in this country, unprecedented in modern history, until 1913. And in 1913, we put in the Federal Reserve, the Rothschild banking system, and by 1929 the country was bankrupt. The war in Libya was over the banking system. He had a gold-backed dinar and was getting all the African countries in there. They had to destroy that. There's a book, I've recommended it a number of times, All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, a free download on the internet. Get it and read it. The Unknown War is another one. Download it and read it. You won't do it. I've mentioned it 1,000 times. What else? I guess that's, Constitutional Convention. When the Congress passes proposed amendments to the Constitution, they still have to be ratified by all of the states to a certain, what is it, 2/3 or something like that? 3/4. They still have to be ratified. Congress can't pass and enact an amendment to the Constitution. They can propose it for the states to decide whether to do it or not.
I don't suppose there's much left for me to say. I know, I will just point out something about calling a Constitutional Convention. We have a distinguished governor named Governor Abbott is proposing the states get together and rewrite the Constitution and shift the power from the federal government to the states back to where it was in the Articles of Federation. I think that's not very wise because it didn't work then and most certainly won't work now with all the problems. We do have problems in the United States, and if we don't take good actions, we are headed downhill. And I think the separation of powers was put there for a reason because they were somewhat reacting about what had happened in England and they didn't want that kind of government. They didn't want one branch of the government to be stronger than another. And they wanted, the people who wrote the Constitution were reasonable in many respects, not all, but in many respects. They were reasonable and they thought reasonable people would be elected, but actually at that time in the United States, only white property owners could vote. And that meant that working people weren't going to be put to be white male, correct. And so that's why I said they were reasonable in the system of government. What's lacking, what many people said, money has bought out and greed has bought out our legislators and presidents, and it's all money and not concerned about everybody else. I think the system of government, as the gentleman preceded me, is a good system. And if you can't have a representative democracy with dumb people, you've got to have people that can think and reasonable and behave based on that. But when the people go with ideology and not think about what they're saying, they create the kind of problems we have right now. If the states would have a harder time, the reason they haven't done it is because they can't agree on it. We have states that are not, the southern states, they have one point of view, the eastern has another, and the northern has another. It'd be difficult to blend, and you won't have a national leader to try to get them to work together. So that will be difficult, and that's why they haven't proposed constitutional amendments. They can, and with 2/3 of the states, they can propose, and then it has to be ratified by the 3/4 of the states. The whole amendment process, the legislative process, the president's not involved in that. He can't veto it. He can speak for it, but he can't veto it. It's kind of like a resolution. I think I think our system is good, but we the people must be good. And we are a reactive nation. We react to things. We don't proact very much. And we need to become more proactive for the good of everybody. And I think in the back of Thomas Jefferson's mind, that's what he didn't practice a lot, what he preached, but he was a brilliant man. And he did a lot of time thinking about what was best. The author of the Declaration of Independence, president of University of Virginia, those are the things he thought was more important than being president of the United States. And he was ambassador to France. I think we the people, we must become more, develop a better understanding of our own system of government. Like someone said earlier, young people don't know anything about history. And if you don't know your history, you repeat it. the parliamentary system may work well for England, but if we had a crisis like they had when the gentleman stood up to resign in the United States, I don't know what would happen, because we haven't had those kind of experiences before. But George F. Kennan was a prolific writer in foreign policy during Roosevelt's time and up in the 60s. George F. Kennan and another gentleman out of New York. But about 40 years ago, he wrote a book which he really described the way things are right now. That we have stalemate and gridlock, and nothing could get done. But I didn't really agree with his proposals. He said we need to have committees to work all this stuff. Well, we got the committees in the House and the Senate, and that don't work too well. But I think it's just we got to be reasonable people, and we got to elect people who are concerned about all of us and not just some of us. If we do that, we'll be different. I always said it on the Supreme Court, Scalia died today.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that because I'm glad.
I'm sorry, couldn't hear what you said. Yes, Scalia died, yeah.
And if we had moderates, conservatives, liberals, 3 of each one of them on the Supreme Court, the decision would be much better, much fairer than what we have right now. But when you have a Supreme Court that's extremely liberal, you're going to get some bad decision. I think the people can bring about change. We brought about change in the 60s with the enacted legislation in the Vietnam War. We brought some major changes, but we're losing ground in that particular area because people are not, everybody is greedy in a certain extent. And we all have to overcome that greed and think about what's best for the community, not what's best for me and my friends. And that's what we got to get beyond. And if we can't get beyond that, I don't care what kind of government, it's not going to solve the problem. Thank you.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is, let's hear it for the Federalists and the Federalist Papers. Oh, well, I was expecting more applause, because then I was going to chastise you because the Federalists were against the Bill of Rights, and the Federalists during the Constitutional Convention were attacking Thomas Jefferson unmercifully because he didn't have a religion that they liked. So let's remember that. Now, we do have a problem. I'm sorry?
Remind us who wrote them. Whose viewpoint was the Federalist paper?
Look. Now it goes out of my mind, but it was Marshall and others.
James Madison.
Madison, right, Madison. Thank you. Thank you.
Alexander Hamilton.
I'm sorry?
Alexander Hamilton, John Jay.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. Now, Justice John Paul Stevens has called for some constitutional amendments in his retirement. The first one is that he wants to get rid of gerrymandering, and the way he wants to do that is by having a constitutional amendment which says that the districts for state legislators and for federal legislators must be contiguous and compact, and it is a burden on the part of the individual states to justify any variation from that rule. He says that for campaign finance, he says that neither the First Amendment nor any other provision of the Constitution shall be construed to prohibit the Congress from passing reasonable regulations on money in elections. He also says that neither the 10th Amendment, the 7th Amendment, or any other provision of this Constitution shall be construed to provide any state agency, or state officer with an immunity from liability for violating any act of Congress or any provision of the Constitution. He says that on the death penalty, he says, that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment such as the death penalty inflicted. And he simply inserts such as the death penalty inflicted into the existing amendment. On the Second Amendment, he says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms when serving in the militia shall not be infringed. Now, what I want to say to you is something that I have said before. I am sick and tired of these right-wing Bible beaters using their Bibles as weapons to beat up on people they don't like and claim that they are somehow morally superior. It's disgraceful, it's disgusting. We are not a theocracy. Everyone deserves respect in this country, whether they be gay, whether they be black, whether they be Muslim, whether they be atheist. It makes no difference. Women, men, everybody deserves equal respect and dignity in this country. The Republicans are a disgrace. They have put into place voter regulations in individual states to put in picture IDs and things like that for, quote, voter integrity at the polls. There is no corruption at the polls on election day. They don't bother to mention mail ballot corruption, which actually does exist because they use it. The Republicans cut the schools, they cut health care. They want to repeal Obamacare because their real motive is to hire security guards to throw people out of the hospitals and out of medical facilities who can't pay so they can just die on the street, and they don't have the courage to admit that that's what they really want to do. There are 13 million people, there are still a number of people in this country, something like 13 million that do not have access to health care. If Republicans get elected, it will be back to 50 million that don't have health care, and the number will keep climbing. The Republicans believe in this crazy trickle-down economics, which is really nothing to do with anything except crushing the middle class by lowering the tax rate on the wealthy, then pumping and dumping the economy, because the ultra wealthy have the ability to scoop up your wealth when the economy crashes, but you get destroyed. The ultra wealthy have the ability to make more money when the economy is good. But the problem is they are so blinded by greed that they don't realize they're killing the goose that laid the golden egg, and once they've driven all of us into poverty, their money is not going to be worth anything. Their possessions are not going to be worth anything, because there are going to be people that are going to be using their Second Amendment rights, pull out their guns, and go and shoot their asses. Excuse my language. But it's the truth. What they are doing is they are setting up a revolution where we, who are not in the top 0.001%, are going to have no choice but to assault them, bring them up, pull out the guillotines like the French did, and cut off their damn heads. And they're doing it to themselves by this crazy business of manipulating the laws. The way they manipulate the laws is by telling us that government is wrong, government can do nothing good, and the taxation is theft, the government schools are destroying your children by indoctrinating them. And what they're doing is they're using negative propaganda, just like Adolf Hitler did, in order to get us to hate each other, so we will be fighting each other so that they don't have to worry about us coming after them. And that is the honest truth. And it's a sad situation. It's disgraceful. We should all be opposed to the Republicans. In fact, I can say right here, if you read the Republican Party platform, they are a hate group. Read their platform. They hate gays, they hate women, and so on. So I will say to this, if you vote for a Republican, you should be ashamed of yourself.
Well, I'm really glad to follow that. However, I would like to, instead of yell at you, I would like to give you some facts, if you would. One of the things that is amazing is how little people know about our Constitution, that argue that we should keep it or change it or whatever, okay? But let me give you a few things, okay? When the ratification came about for the Constitution, only 3 states, okay, unanimously ratified the Constitution. Only 3 unanimously. In 10 states, it was divided. And it was divided in such a way that you can appreciate it when you read the numbers. Massachusetts, it was 187 to 168. That was the vote in Massachusetts. In New Hampshire, it was 57 to 47. In Virginia, it was 87 to 79. In New York, it won by 3 votes. So all these people that are talking about, new conventions and things like that, if they really go back and see what happened then, they wouldn't be so anxious to go about making the moves that they want to make. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that, and again, this has to do with our blindness to our history. There's a difference between what I would call the framers and I would call the founding fathers. In other words, founding fathers, I would consider people like John and Samuel Adams, Tom Paine, Thomas Jefferson, those kind of people. They did not participate in the convention, okay? Now, the framers, only 8 of the framers signed the Declaration of Independence. So as you can see, I think a lot of people just have very misguided opinions based on little knowledge about what went on when our Constitution was created, okay? And there's kind of a myth about it in a way that says that the Constitution has been the model for every democratic country in the world after that. Well, actually, it's the opposite. Ours is a very unique Constitution because we're the only country in the world that uses it. Every other democracy in the world is different from ours. So that's something to maybe think about. If it's so good, then how come nobody's copied it? I don't know whether it's bad or not, but we need to look at it. And there's two strategies I think that we can use to think about this thing. One is what we're doing here today. In other words, we need to widen the critical examination of the Constitution and its shortcomings. And the other one is to achieve greater political equality within the limits of the present Constitution. We want to reduce the vast inequalities in the existing distribution of political resources. And I think everybody agrees with that because that's why people are angry, because the resources are not spread equally. However, the problem we do have is that the way the Constitution was written, those who possess the greater resources with strong defenses have the advantage to veto any changes against our efforts to reduce the privileged positions in our country.
I want to remind everybody, of course, the Declaration of Independence was penned primarily by Thomas Jefferson. And the last sentence is, and for the support of this declaration, we mutually, defined as affecting all parties equally in a shared manner, pledge our lives, and with a firm reliance on the protection of God's providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Now, this is a commercial about a misinformed middle class. And a few of you folks in this room have read that book I wrote called The Rise and Fall of America's Middle Class. And it's free. If you want a copy of it, jimdavis11@gmail.com. Put in their book, and you've got it in PDF format.
Could you repeat that, please?
Repeat what? The book name?
Email.
Oh, jimdavis11a@gmail.com. 11A. The number 11. Letter A. At gmail.com. It's a book, yeah, that I wrote. Where's Mr. Churchill's look-alike at? Right there. You read it, didn't you?
I did.
What do you think?
It was very good, Jim. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It hit some nails on the head.
Okay.
If Beasley recommends it, I must delve into it. I probably disagree. But maybe it did hit a few nails. Speaking of nails, the Chinese have a situation of what they call nail houses. It's really interesting. Here we have eminent domain and everyone getting their land taken. Of course, I can think of situations with the Bundys and the Hammonds. But in China, people that Mao guaranteed that they would have their dwelling and no one would mess with them, there are freeways built around them. They're in the middle of malls. It's very interesting that Chinese individuals are able to hold on to their dwellings and Americans are not. Now, this comment I have, let's preface it, I have a comment. This really applies to the last meeting, but also just a little bit to this meeting as well. Jim Love, I wish he were here, appeared to be invoking revolution, and I would caution anyone in any meeting like this that this meeting should not allow, and we should not allow anyone to invoke violence. Now, when our esteemed colleague here was speaking about what could happen to the elite if the things they have set in motion continue, I would agree with that, but yet you don't want to recommend violence in a public meeting like this. I have at meetings of this sort shut down my camera, taken my lights, and left, and basically closed the meeting when someone advocated violence. We don't do that. So we need to remember, if anyone brings it up, please, as the audience, this is nowhere we really want to go. And bad words, I've heard a few bad words in these meetings. Sometimes emotion gets involved. But okay, I guess that's my wrap-up comment.
Well, a lot of comments and personal hobby horses have been taking place tonight, but I think we're lost in the briars and the weeds and stuff. When you remember the fundamental principles of the Constitution is it's a system of checks and balances. There were many competing interests to be taken advantage of. People that condemn the Federalists don't realize it was out of the disagreements between the Federalists and the anti-Federalists that we got the Bill of Rights. So that's a very myopic view of things. The Federalist Papers are full of brilliant insights, and if without the Federalist Papers, we probably would not have a country today. The country got along for about 100 years with checks and balances. The checks and balances started to erode right before the Civil War, when the ultimate Blue Ribbon Commission, known as the Supreme Court, in a decision, a 7-2 decision, came down with the deplorable, the worst decision ever made by a court anywhere, and that might include Adolf Hitler's People's Court. In the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was owned by a man who was in the military and a medical doctor, and he was part of a setup to overturn slavery. They thought for sure, he lived in a number of different states, free and slave, and the people that supported him thought for sure that the Supreme Court would rule against him. But we have an idiot who was probably the 1/10 of 1% of the time, and they wouldn't even address the issues. They got around it by saying that black slaves or black peoples weren't people. And it's worth about a couple of hours just to go through that stinking rotten decision, but it cost us a civil war. So I think, as George Santa Anna, the late great Harvard historian, said, those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. And I think the silliest thing that I've heard tonight, I hate to say it, is that we form blue ribbon committees and get groups out of the Congress. This has never worked. It's not unbiased. The main checks and balances was throughout the first 100 years or so was that people went to serve in the House of Representatives and the Senate for a short period of time and came home. There were no professional 20, 30, and 40-year lifetime politicians we have today. The problem with that is they're too easily bought off and corrupted. The second thing was, if you will remember, I think it's the 19th Amendment, but it was one of the senators were never directly elected. They were appointed by the various state legislatures. 17th, okay, thank you. It is that particular check and balance was to put a governor, so to speak, on the House, House of Representatives that represented the people directly, because there were different state interests and there were different people's interests. And the idea is not, as our speaker maintained, the other side of saying things inhibit change is to say that this system imposes a little cooling off period, a place for people to be rational and for people to think. But starting in the election of 1912, William Howard Taft was running for a second term. He had succeeded Theodore Roosevelt. He was Theodore Roosevelt's hand-picked candidate for president in 1908. They got into logger jams, and then Roosevelt made the disastrous decision to run as a third party. That led to the election of Woodrow Wilson, also known as Dudley Do-Right. He was just barely over 40% of the popular vote. It was during the Wilson administration that, number one, they introduced the 17th Amendment, which made senators to be elected by the people. They introduced the Federal Reserve, which may or may not be a good thing, but if it's a good thing, why not have it audited and be public about it? The people that support the Federal Reserve are very opposed to that for some reason, and that's always mystified me. Then the other amendment they put through was a federal income tax. Now, the government is entitled to enough money to run its own business, and we did that for over 100 years. Those of you who think the federal income tax is good, then you must support the Vietnam War, the wars in the Middle East, because that's as well as the First World War and the Second World War. Congress and the federal government could never go to war because they did not have enough money. A man named J.P. Morgan, the ultimate capitalist, had to finance the Spanish-American War, or there would not have been a war. We would not have been able to get involved in World War I without the direct involvement, again, of J.P. Morgan and his investment banker cronies on Wall Street. Now, if we did not have an income tax today, or let's just say the government didn't have that money, then these wars that you all gripe about, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and all the Bush's adventurism, they couldn't take, because the government would have to come back to the people to raise the money, just as they did in World War II. Even though we had an income tax in World War II, it was not near enough, large enough to finance the war, and there were many people, Hollywood stars, politicians going around selling war bonds. It was a patriotic thing. So I think these are, what's wrong in the country is due mostly to a getting away from the original checks and balance. And it happens so slowly, people don't realize it. And I think you're absolutely correct in that, well, I'm gonna get as much time as, if you don't mind, to rebut some of this stuff. We have a situation that has grown on us like a slow-growing cancer, and it's not gonna be changed by Congress. It's not gonna be changed by the bureaucrats. For one example, the Defense Department had about 350,000 employees during when Ronald Reagan first came in. They now have almost 1 million. What are they there for? What about the other departments? They grow, and they can't do anything. We didn't have a problem after World War II because our economy boomed. People like George Kennan, who was a brilliant statesman, is known for sending the long telegram from Moscow. It was long because it has 8,000 words. He was the first to identify the threat of communists in the government. And he is certainly no Republican and no conservative. The longer people stay in Congress, the more easily it is for them to be bought off and corrupted. If you want to have a constitutional convention to change things, come see me. I happen to have in my little hot hand here some information that I got at a meeting Tuesday night, and this is the one thing that scares the heck out of the politicians. But just as John Paul Stevens, again another example of probably the 0.01% elitist, he's free to propose all he wants to in a constitutional convention. There have been 10,000 amendments to the Constitution proposed, and not only 27 of them have gotten out. Did you do that to everybody else or just to me, ma'am? Just don't do it. All right, good. I didn't see it. I'm going to finish then. John Paul, all these Cookburger amendments, you're free to get them out and put them out, but they will likely not get out of a constitution of the states, and they will certainly not pass the states because you have to have 2/3, which means that there are 13 states that will block any attempt to undermine the Second Amendment or any other thing that is opposed by the people. So in summary, it's one little thing. We got away from checks and balances that is the cause of the problem. All the other things y'all are talking about, I think, are symptoms.
I forgot to tell you about, I guess you might call it a recommendation for that book I wrote. It came from a diehard Republican and it took me 1.5 years to talk her into reading that book. And after she read it, she sent me an email that said, "Dear Jim, thank you for talking me into reading your book. I can't believe what I just read. Them effing snakes."
I guess I'm the last one standing. So I want to thank our speaker for doing a terrific job here tonight and for getting everybody involved in what they think. You brought up a good subject that as everybody has their 10 cents worth in. And it's good to hear that, and I hope you get to respond to what they have to say. My own view, I think our biggest problem with our government is that we have the best Congress that money can buy. That's happened because we have a situation where money has bought everything. And so we have, what is the definition of fascism? That was brought up here earlier, but it's, money controls, we have corporations controlling the government because that's what's happened. And we have gridlock in Congress because they won't get anything done because they're bought and paid for in many respects. Someone gets elected to Congress, the next thing they're owned and operated by the money. I ran for Congress 4 times. First time I had $100,000 in campaign contributions. The second time, they all went to Gephardt in Washington and said, where should we send the money? And he said, send open races, send it to incumbents, don't send anything to any challengers. Challengers haven't got a dime since before the year 2000. Challengers cannot win elections. It makes the Congress very safe for the incumbent. And all he has to do is go along with what the money people tell him to do, and he gets reelected. Adlai Stevenson was a senator from Illinois. He lasted 1 term, and he quit. Everybody's mad at him. Why are you quitting? He said, well, he had to spend 70% of his time raising money. He wasn't going to do it. He said, get somebody else. And that's why he quit. Then he went on to the UN and other things. But the whole point I'm getting at is that we have money controlling Congress. This has to change. And Congress has to do it. We can't do it. People in Congress have to vote something in that will change the situation that's there. So you have to ask yourself, what will they vote for? In my view, they'll vote to have free airtime the last 90 days of a general election, and they'll get to keep their money. They'll vote for that because there's no history of a challenger beating an incumbent. And once they put it in, some challengers will beat some incumbents, and then you'll change Congress. It'll represent the people instead of representing the people buying their vote in Washington. Once you do that, then you can make some changes. Then you can put tariffs on corporations that are overseas, and you get the jobs back here, because an economy doesn't work without manufacturing, selling, everything else. If you don't have manufacturing, you're going to lose. You're going to be like England. We'll go down the drain, and we don't need to. That's the direction we're in, and that's what's happened. That's my view, anyway. And our speaker gets to comment and close this meeting.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, you got another comment? Come on up here.
Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. I thought I got everybody.
I didn't speak up. My fault. So I just took a couple notes, some bullet points. This is my first time. Hi, I'm Patrick. I'm an anarchist. I don't know how many people here have ever met one or talked to one, but there's something that's been kind of glossed over in this whole meeting, and that's the idea of consent. So I just wanted to have a couple bullet point kind of ideas on that. So something that's really annoying is that recently I changed the window blinds in my house from the white blinds that it came with to a different color. And my HOA came along and told me they were going to fine me $50 a day if I didn't put them back. That was annoying. If I wanted to use my house as a business, if I wanted to run my business out of my house, I would have to go and convince a few million people in the city of Dallas to allow me to get it zoned for that. If I wanted to carry a gun on my own property, I would have to go to the state legislature and convince, a few tens of millions of people to allow me to carry my gun on my own property. If I wanted to grow a certain type of vegetation in my backyard, I would have to go to the federal government and convince 100 million people to let me do that. The point is that only one of those 4 examples is moral or ethical, and it's the first one with my HOA. When I bought my house, I consented to those rules. I said, I choose to live here, I agree to the rules of this community, and I accept that you have some strange say-so in the color of my blinds. I do not consent to your restrictions on my house. I do not consent to your restrictions on the vegetation in my backyard. I do not consent to your restrictions on what I can carry on my person, like a gun. there's a huge difference. Consent is everything. Consent, in a lot of ways, is morality. The difference between theft and charity is consent. The difference between rape and lovemaking is consent. The difference between the guy stabbing you and your surgeon is consent. Governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed. The great indoctrination, the great delusion, is that consent can somehow be collectivized. It can be rolled up into smaller groups and bigger groups and national groups. It's not the case at all. Consent is individual. 51% of the people voting to be ruled by a government does not result in the other 49 being subjugated. It results in those 51% agreeing to rule themselves and the other 49 being left the F alone. I hate the terms that I've heard tonight, and it's just kind of irritated me sitting over there. We, us, Americans, society, we the people, stop speaking for me. You don't have my consent. You can't vote the guy stabbing me into a surgeon. The great hubris of your politics is the presumption that you know best for everyone around you. I don't care what side you're on. I do not consent. Your government is getting on my freedom. I would ask you to keep it to yourself. I would also ask you to think about the power of your own individual personal consent. Thanks.
Well, is there any more? That's it, I guess. Our speaker gets to comment on the comment and close this meeting. You get the last word now. Come on up here.
My hamstring.
Oh, all right.
At one point in my life, I worked for a very wealthy family in Denver, Colorado. The headquarters was in the Denver Club building, and so anyway, I would ride up and down in the elevator, and every once in a while, this old guy. Now I'm an old guy. But this old guy would come in and say, and evidently he was a Republican because he said, I'm going up to the Eisenhower Chapel in the building to pray for the Democrats. Well, more recently in my life, I worked as a psychotherapist, and a colleague of mine once made a comment on something I had written about Freud. I said something good about Freud, I guess. And he said, we don't go over that today. He had all these weird theories and this, that. Well, my response was, yeah, but Freud got everybody thinking, didn't he? And I guess that's the purpose of my efforts tonight. The purpose was to stimulate thought and an exchange of views. So I thank you very much.
Well, that's it. So we'll see you next week. They close here at 10:30, so you're free to continue and carry on the conversation.